Three black SUVs pull up to a picturesque beachfront home in coastal Maine. Men in dark suits approach the door. Inside, Lila Petrov, 65, looks up in confusion as the doorbell rings. Her husband of 40 years, Andrei, stands perfectly still, his expression unreadable. When Lila opens the door, an agent shows his badge. "Ma'am, we need to speak with Dr. Alexei Primakov." Lila stares blankly at the agent. "You must have the wrong house. My husband is Andrei Petrov." The agent's face remains impassive. "No, ma'am. His name is Alexei Primakov." For 4 decades, Lila and Andrei Petrov were the envy of Northport, a charming seaside village on the rugged coast of Maine. Their idyllic marriage was the gold standard to which other couples aspired. Andrei was an esteemed oceanographer whose groundbreaking research on North Atlantic ecosystems had garnered him tenure at the nearby university and accolades from the international scientific community. Lila was the beloved headmistress of the local preparatory academy, a passionate educator who had inspired generations of young minds. Each autumn, on the anniversary of their wedding, the Petrovs would gather by the old lighthouse on the point to reaffirm their vows, a cherished tradition that had become a highlight of Northport's social calendar. Starry-eyed newlyweds would seek their counsel on the secrets to lasting matrimony. Their children Natasha, a brilliant marine biologist, and Mikhail, a rising star in the U.S. Attorney's Office, held up their parents' devotion as the paragon of romantic love. Yet beneath the shining veneer of the Petrovs' storybook union lay a truth so explosive. Its revelation would compel Lila to reevaluate her entire history with the man who shared her bed and her heart. Before continuing our tale, please share with us your current whereabouts. As the waning rays of summer danced through the stained glass of St. Basil's Chapel that fateful September day in 1981, Lila Fedorova floated down the aisle like a vision in her grandmother's lovingly restored lace gown. At the altar awaited Andrei Petrov, the aloof but strikingly handsome young research scientist who had swept into her world just a year and a half prior. Andrei, the son of Russian immigrants, possessed an old-world reserve that most mistook for aloofness, but Lila had glimpsed the tenderness within. Their whirlwind courtship had been an intricate dance of blossoming affection. Andrei's path first crossed with Lila's when he visited her primary school classroom to give a guest lecture on the wonders of the seashore. Though clearly more at ease among microscopes than rambunctious 8-year-olds, his arcane knowledge of crabs and seaweed had enthralled the children. Afterward, Lila peppered him with questions, and he invited her to tour his lab. That first spark soon kindled into ardent romance. After exchanging vows, the newlyweds settled into a quaint cottage overlooking the churning Atlantic. Andrei dedicated himself to studying the intricate dance of currents and habitats in the chilly Maine waters, his esoteric pursuits occasionally drawing him away to conferences and field expeditions, though never for overly long. Lila continued molding young minds, her innate gifts as an educator guiding her from schoolmarm to administrator. In 1984, they welcomed Natasha into the world, a contemplative infant who inherited her father's scientific curiosity and Slavic features. Their son Mikhail arrived 2 years later, a fierce-witted spark plug even in diapers. As he grew, Mikhail gravitated toward Lila's passion for order and justice, ultimately leading him to pursue a prosecutorial career. The Petrovs wove the fabric of their family with annual rituals that became institutions unto themselves. None was more hallowed than their anniversary pilgrimage to the old Northport Lighthouse each fall. What began as an intimate observance, just Andrei with a basket of Lila's favorite foods and Lila with a diary for recording the year's milestones, gradually morphed into something akin to a township holiday. Enchanted friends begged to partake, and dewy-eyed young marrieds sought the Petrovs' wisdom for keeping love evergreen. By their silver anniversary, the lighthouse gathering had blossomed into an affair requiring folding tables and fairy lights. Andrei would wax poetic about the seasonal metamorphosis of tides and temperature gradients as Lila spearheaded 3-legged races and scavenger hunts for the little ones. The day's zenith always arrived with the ceremonial slicing of a tower of cupcakes as old neighbors raised flutes of Prosecco to toast the couple's unfaltering bond. "Look how his eyes sparkle when he sees her," the guests would cluck. For decades on and still so besotted, and besotted they unquestionably were. At least Lila harbored no misgivings about the depth of Andrei's ardor. He may not have been one for ostentatious displays, but his adoration manifested in a ceaseless stream of subtle gestures. He marked milestones, intuited her wishes, and championed her professional ascent. When she attained the headmistress post in 2005, he staged a fete for her featuring the grateful testimonies of former pupils. Of course, every matrimony weathers its own squalls. The Petrovs' union was no exception. Andrei bristled at having his likeness captured on film, a quirk Lila chalked up to self-consciousness over his thinning mane and the spectacles that had become necessary in his 30s. And each February, he would vanish for weeks to some far-flung scientific conference or symposium, reappearing with kitschy souvenirs and tales of cutting-edge research. On occasion, night terrors would descend, leaving Andrei thrashing and spewing what Lila took to be gibberish, until years of exposure revealed the words as Russian. As Natasha and Mikhail set out to chart their own paths, Lila and Andrei eased into what promised to be a golden autumn graced with grandchildren and contented repose. Andrei's tireless investigations had brought him veneration in academia, while Lila's intrepid stewardship had secured her academy's perch among the state's finest. With a flush retirement account, robust health, and the esteem of all who knew them, they seemed poised to savor the fruits of an exemplary joint voyage. The first subtle ripples upon their placid seas coincided with their ruby anniversary in September 2020. Though COVID cast a pall over the festivities, Andrei marked the milestone with a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a miniature lighthouse. "To be your beacon home, always," he murmured as he fastened the chain around Lila's slender throat. 2 months on, as Lila rummaged through the attic in search of old snapshots for an anniversary scrapbook surprise, a glint of metal tucked behind a carton of James' boyhood rock collections snagged her gaze. Drawing closer, she discovered a locked steel strongbox she had never before laid eyes upon. The key gleamed dully from its perch atop the lid, almost goading her to unearth its secrets. Inside the mysterious cache, Lila found a passport bearing Andrei's likeness but an unfamiliar name and date of birth, 3 years earlier than the one she had toasted each January for 4 decades. Even more baffling were the stamps from places Andrei had never mentioned visiting: Moscow, East Berlin, Warsaw, all hubs of the old Eastern Bloc. Lila cradled the cryptic document in her lap, the first gossamer thread that would ultimately unspool 40 years of intimate deceptions. "Andrei," Lila called downstairs, the alien passport clutched tightly in one trembling fist. "Could you come up here for a moment, please?" Andrei's footfalls were unhurried as he made his way to the attic, but when his eyes landed upon the navy booklet in Lila's grasp, she glimpsed a terror flash across his features, vanishing as quickly as a ripple upon a midnight pond. "What have you got there, love?" he asked, his voice a touch too airy. "I'm not entirely sure," Lila replied, the words emerging cooler than she had intended. "It appears to be your passport, but the name, the stamps, I don't understand." Andrei shifted his weight and glided a hand over his jawline, a tell Lila recognized as his thoughtful professor affectation. "Ah, yes, that old thing," he said with an unconvincing chuckle. "A memento of some of my earliest research from long before we met. But the dates and the name, a product of the times, darling. The Cold War made for strange bedfellows in the oceanographic community. That passport was part of a joint research program with some of our Soviet counterparts. All very cloak and dagger, you understand? But perfectly above board, I assure you." Lila scrutinized her husband's face, an uneasy minnow of doubt darting through her mind. "And you never mentioned this because—" "Ancient history, water under the bridge," Andrei said breezily, reaching to tip up her chin with a forefinger. "Nothing to trouble you with." He folded the passport into his palm. "Best if I dispose of this relic. No sense courting undue confusion." And with that, the subject seemed to evaporate like sea spray. But a stubborn film of unease now glazed Lila's view of the man she had pledged her life to. "Lost in thought?" Andrei inquired as he steered their Volvo home from the faculty Yuletide fete the following week. Lila picked distractedly at a hangnail. "It struck me tonight that in all our years together, There doesn't seem to exist a single crisp photograph of you at any community function. Andrei drummed his fingers on the wheel. Is that so strange? You know I'm not one to preen for cameras. Well, yes, but even at Natasha's graduation or Mikhail's engagement party, you appointing yourself official photographer, it just seems odd in retrospect. A good archivist stays behind the lens. Love, he said, patting her knee, and Lila felt a prickle of irritation at his blithe dismissal. That night, with Andrei snoring softly beside her, Lila padded to the study and opened the old lacquered accordion file where they stored family mementos. Flipping through the battered albums that chronicled 4 decades of Thanksgivings, science fairs, and beach picnics, a pattern quickly surfaced. While candid shots of Lila and the children abounded, Andrei was largely absent from frames that captured community events or public moments. No ribbon cutting when the Marine Lab unveiled its new wing. No family portrait at the town's centennial. He beamed from pictures taken at their secluded cottage, but had apparently mastered the art of dematerializing whenever festivities attracted a wider audience. Shutting the albums with a smack, Lila allowed herself to acknowledge the nascent dread that had been brewing since her attic discovery. Something was rotten in the state of Maine. She just couldn't yet bring herself to confront what that might portend. As winter's chill deepened into the new year, so too did Lila's suspicions. Had Andrei's annual February absences always spanned quite so many weeks? And why did she now struggle to recall him introducing her to any colleagues from these conferences he dutifully jetted off to each year? One sleety morning over the breakfast dishes, Lila aimed for nonchalance as she remarked, "I caught the tail end of a documentary last evening about the CIA's covert efforts to undermine the Soviets during the Cold War years. Funny to think how recent that all was. High schools were still teaching Russian as a matter of course back then. Did you study any languages at university?" Andrei scarcely glanced up from his tablet. "You know I'm hopeless with foreign tongues, dear. Never got much further than bonjour and auf Wiedersehen." Lila frowned, remembering something curious. Just 2 summers past, they had entertained a senior Kremlin science attaché at a formal luncheon. When the diplomat struggled with English, Andrei had effortlessly slipped into what certainly sounded like fluent Russian, the 2 men gabbing animatedly for a quarter of an hour. At the time, Lila had mentally applauded her husband's cultural dexterity, assuming he had picked up the tongue through his international research partnerships. Now the recollection roused an unignorable serpent of doubt. Matters came to a head in late January when Mikhail rang to share some intriguing professional news. "You won't believe the case that just landed on my docket," he enthused, the fervor of the young prosecutor ringing down the line. "We're going after a network of deep-cover agents, remnants of a KGB operation to infiltrate strategically positioned scientific organizations. Guys who essentially disappeared into false identities. You're going to flip when I tell you their method. These spooks would target real Americans with similar backgrounds who had died or gone missing. Assume their names and credentials, build whole lives. Marriages, the works." Lila pressed a fist to her lips as a tide of nausea crested in her gut. "When are you coming home next, Misha?" she asked levelly. "I think your mama could use a visit." And so on a leaden afternoon in early February, Lila parked outside the thicket of brutalist dormitories that housed students at Andrei's campus and glassed the rain-smeared walks for her son's athletic frame. When he at last ducked into the car, shaking droplets from the collar of his trench coat like a shaggy spaniel, she wasted no time with pleasantries. "Tell me everything about this espionage case." Mikhail shifted in his seat to face her squarely, his brows knit. "Ma, you know I'm not really at liberty to discuss an active investigation." "Indulge your mother?" she pleaded, hating the note of desperation that had crept into her tone. "Call it a thought experiment. If I had, purely hypothetically, stumbled upon some irregularities concerning your father, his provenance, his bona fides, what would that signify in the context of your case?" Mikhail appraised her as if she were a recalcitrant witness withering under cross-examination. After a few protracted beats, he exhaled gustily and pinched the bridge of his nose, a carbon copy of the exact gesture Andrei had enacted 1,000 times over their decades together. "Theoretically speaking," he began carefully, We believe the Soviets seeded moles across a range of industries, academics, engineers, even some foreign service officers, where they could glean information advantageous to the motherland with little direct handling. And no one detected them? You have to understand the level of sophistication here, Ma. Targets were handpicked for compatibility, background, appearance, professional field. Inserting an agent was a matter of watching and waiting for just the right John Doe to drop off the map, then activating a replacement with an immaculate paper trail. We're unraveling cover stories with spouses and offspring stretching back to the early 80s. Lila felt her breath turn to caulk in her lungs. But how is that possible? What kind of person could so completely dissolve into a false existence? Mikhail steepled his fingers against his lips, lost in thought. These were the ultimate true believers, Ma. Men and women conditioned from youth to subordinate any shred of individual identity to the glory of the party. Shedding one persona for another would be an act of the highest patriotism, the ultimate sacrifice for the cause. Lila gazed sightlessly at the spokes of the windshield wipers dragging across the glass. A sacrifice, a supreme act of devotion. But to what? To whom? The person inhabiting the tidy cape on Northport's pebbled beach was by every outward indication the very model of a committed husband and father. He had been beside Lila every step of the way as they erected the scaffolding of their shared existence. Two splendid children, now grown. A home that rang with laughter and tears, with science projects gone awry on the kitchen table and skinned knees from tumbles off the old tire swing. Lazy Sunday morning crosswords and raucous Monopoly sessions that stretched into the wee hours when the lightning got bad over the harbor. Could every cherished memory be rendered counterfeit by some clandestine allegiance? The questions cartwheeled through her brain as Mikhail turned his key in the ignition to deliver her home through the dreary downpour. Toward a cottage that increasingly felt like an elaborate facade. Toward a man she feared she had never truly known at all. The next morning, over burnt toast and weak tea, Lila watched Andrei from across their battered farmhouse table. He scanned the headlines on his tablet, spectacles slipping down his nose, a portrait of benign distraction. Her gaze flickered to the faded anchor tattoo on his left forearm, one he had always claimed was a memento of a collegiate misadventure. How easy it would be, she thought bitterly, to invent a dashing backstory for an unsanctioned emblem when spycraft was your stock in trade. "You're staring, love?" Andrei remarked without looking up. "Something on your mind?" "Your conference," Lila said abruptly. "It's next week, isn't it?" A shadow flitted across Andrei's face, vanishing so quickly she might have imagined it. "Ah yes, the symposium in Chicago. Leading a panel discussion this year on the impact of invasive carp species in the Great Lakes. Scintillating stuff." His voice lilted with practiced breeziness. "I was thinking I might come along this time. We haven't had a getaway in ages, and I've always wanted to see the Art Institute." "You'd be bored to tears, dear," Andrei said a touch too swiftly. "Nothing but tedious data on fish migration patterns and dam construction. Best if I fly solo, as per usual." Lila tamped down a surge of frustration. Allow a wife to spend time with her husband? Truly an intolerable imposition. Andrei set down the tablet and reached across the table to cup her cheek. "You know you are always first in my thoughts, Lilia." The Russian diminutive rolled off his tongue, as it did only in their most intimate moments. "Let's plan a proper holiday once this dreadful winter is behind us. The Greek Isles, maybe. You always look so beautiful with the Aegean wind in your hair." Despite herself, Lila felt her resolve waver. It would be so easy to sink into the illusion, to abandon herself once more to the rhythms of the only life she had ever craved. But Pandora's box had sprung open, and there could be no returning to blissful ignorance. She touched her lips chastely to Andrei's weathered knuckles. "Of course, darling. But you will check in, won't you? Let me know you've arrived safely." "To the minute," he assured her, and Lila tried not to let her imagination conjure the myriad of minutes that had gone unaccounted for over the yawning expanse of their union. That night, as Andrei stacked kindling in the hearth, Lila stole up the attic stairs, armed with a notion and a hairpin. The strongbox yielded readily to her trembling fingers, its tumblers as submissive as she herself had been for so many turns of the calendar page. Inside, she felt her heart clench at the relics of a man who might not exist outside her own fevered imaginings. The battered leather folio, the tarnished Orthodox cross, a stack of curling Cyrillic newsprint. Mementos Andrei, or whoever he was, had hoarded like talismans of a phantom self. She was about to close the lid when her eye caught on a scrap of paper, crammed haphazardly into a corner of the box. The sheet was creased and smudged with the grimy residue of secrets that could only endure in darkness. In a spindly hand, someone had scrawled a string of digits, a telephone number with a country code Lila recognized as Russian. Below it was a single word, written in the same Slavic script that had confounded her since that first fateful glimpse of Andrei's impossible passport. Later that evening, Lila would enter the word into an online translator and feel a frisson of exultation and sorrow in equal measure. Freedom. On the morning of Andrei's departure, Lila rose early to prepare his favorite breakfast of buckwheat kasha and lingonberry jam. She kissed him tenderly as he hefted his suitcase into the waiting taxi, breathing in the spicy scent of his aftershave as if it were incense at the altar of a fallen icon. He whispered into her hair, and she didn't need Google to recognize the Russian declaration of love. As the cab rattled down the drive and disappeared into the fog, Lila stood a moment longer on the porch, a skein of memories and bright imaginings settling over her like gossamer. Then she squared her shoulders and went inside to wait for Mikhail. The hours dripped by in anxious silence until at last the throaty purr of her son's Audi announced his arrival. He swept through the front door in a corona of nervous energy, shedding his overcoat and scarf in a crumpled heap. "Is he gone?" Lila nodded mutely, motioning Mikhail to join her at the kitchen table. For a long moment, they simply appraised each other, 1,000 unspoken fears and questions caroming between them like invisible shrapnel. When Lila finally spoke, her voice emerged flinty with resolve. "I need you to tell me everything." And so Mikhail did. Of how a Ukrainian double agent had recently begun funneling decrypted KGB cables to the NSA, cables that laid bare the staggering scope of the Soviets' infiltration at the height of the Cold War. Of the existence of an ultra-clandestine program codenamed Moros, under which hand-selected operatives were dispatched to the West with flawlessly forged identities and embedded in pillars of bourgeois respectability. Of the ruthless genius with which Moscow Center, the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Directorate, preyed upon the lonely, the disenfranchised, and the dead to supply their moles with unimpeachable second skins. "We always assumed their tradecraft was sophisticated," Mikhail explained. "But until these cables surfaced, I don't think anyone grasped the sheer evil of it. Imagine marrying some wholesome girl with no inkling that her one true love is just some rusky plant charged with filching nuclear secrets between Little League games and date nights at the Rotary Club. It's a violation on the most visceral level." Lila's head throbbed with each new revelation, but she willed composure into her voice as she asked the question that had been lacerating her insides for days. "This program, Moros, was Andrei part of it?" Mikhail locked eyes with her, his gaze heavy with an empathy that made Lila want to scream. After a beat, he reached into his satchel and withdrew a manila folder. The front bore an alphanumeric file designation and a single name in blocky red Cyrillic. "It means seagull," he said quietly, answering her unspoken question. "We think it was his code name. The information is, well, it's damning, ironclad enough to draw up a warrant." Lila gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles blanched bone white. "Who is he, Misha? Who have I given my life to?" Mikhail opened the folder and fanned out a series of documents, some typed, some dense with handwritten Cyrillic, a few bearing official-looking stamps and seals. With a shaking finger, he tapped a black-and-white photograph that seemed to have been clipped from a larger group shot. A painfully young and serious Andrei stared back at her, unmistakable despite the lozenge cap and stiff, ill-fitting uniform. "His real name is Alexei Ivanovich Primakov," Mikhail said, his voice unbearably gentle. "Born 1952 in Ekaterinburg, recruited to the KGB upon completion of his marine biology studies at Moscow State University. We think the real Andrei Petrov died in a boating accident in Arkhangelsk in 1979. Primakov would have stepped into his shoes sometime in early 1980. Lila heard the words as if from the bottom of a deep well, the syllables distorted and muted by the icy water flooding her lungs. Alexei Primakov, 1952. KGB. The tumblers of her existence gave an ominous rattle, every foundational truth of her life yawning open to swallow her whole. As if from a great distance, she heard herself croak out the only question that still mattered. Did he love me? Mikhail blinked at her, momentarily nonplussed. He riffled through the dossier until he located a sheaf of onionskin pages, dense with the now familiar Cyrillic scrawl. These are his personal journals, he said slowly. They date back to his first days in Northport. It seems he kept up the habit even after he went dark. He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. From what we can tell, he writes about you. Often. There are expressions of affection that evolve over time into something that reads as quite genuine to our analyst. If he was play acting, he was either the most gifted sociopath the KGB ever produced, or he deserves an Oscar for penning his own prison sentence. Lila squeezed her eyes shut against the welling tears, but they crested her lashes anyway to spill down her cheeks in briny runnels. Her chin dropped to her chest, all the grief and betrayal and bewilderment of the preceding weeks rising up her gullet like magma. Mikhail half rose from his chair, one hand extended in mute supplication. Ma, I can't begin to imagine. Leave. What? Mikhail froze, features stricken. Lila lifted her head, her expression hardening into a mask of pure determination, as immovable and ancient as the glacier-scored bluffs beyond the window. You have a job to do, Prosecutor Petrov, and I don't intend to be here when you do it. Understanding dawned in Mikhail's eyes. For an instant, he looked impossibly young, a tow-headed boy hovering at the threshold of a choice no mortal soul should ever be asked to make. Then his posture straightened, a perfect mirror of Andrei at his most implacable. Are you absolutely certain? Lila gazed unseeing at the little embroidered lobster buoys festooning the kitchen curtains, talismans of a shared history as richly imagined as any cover story. For once in my life, she said softly, I am choosing my own truth. They had rehearsed everything. There could be no room for hesitation, no margin for improvisation. Agents would be en route to O'Hare International within the hour to take Dr. Andrei Petrov into custody. Lila knew she had scarcely half a day to put enough distance between herself and Northport before the force of her son's righteousness came crashing down upon the quiet cottage. No goodbyes, no clumsy justifications. She would simply vanish, a final magic act to close out 4 decades of deception and blind faith. Even the children would be kept in the dark for as long as the FBI deemed operationally necessary. For all intents and purposes, Lilian Fedorova Petrova was about to drop off the face of the earth. She allowed herself a single indulgence as she slipped behind the wheel of their battered Saab, the go-bag she had hidden weeks ago thudding heavily in the passenger footwell. The little lighthouse pendant Andrei had fastened about her throat on their ruby anniversary glimmered sadly in the afternoon light, all her girlish folly and wifely devotion encompassed within one perfect sterling tear. With a shuddering breath, Lila yanked the chain free and tossed it onto the driver's seat. She had already become an afterthought in her own existence, a lovely fiction fed to a lonely man who had surrendered everything to an insatiable empire. Her love, the genuine article though it might have been, was no longer enough to tether her to ground zero of her own unmaking. As she turned the key in the ignition, the first fat drops of a spring squall began to patter against the windshield. The lawn that had hosted 40 years of anniversary picnics and firefly-studded 4th of July shimmered wetly as she nosed the car down the pebbled drive one final time. The deluge had reached monsoon proportions by the time she crossed the state line into New Hampshire. Visibility dwindled to nil, the asphalt ahead and behind erased by curtains of icy gray. Lila switched on the emergency blinkers and crept onto the shoulder, breath coming in shallow gasps as the enormity of her flight battered at the edges of her consciousness. In all her agonized contingency planning, she had never quite reckoned with the reality of this moment, the point of no return when she would cleave herself from every trapping and tether of selfhood and step into an uncertain future as foreign as her spurned husband's mother tongue. It was one thing to daydream about liberation from the chains of matrimonial caprice. Another thing entirely to gun the engine as the iron portcullis of the past clanged shut at your back. Fumbling beneath the passenger seat, Lila's fingers clumsy with cold and adrenaline, she retrieved the burner phone she had purchased with cash on a clandestine trip to Bangor the week prior. The number, still committed to memory, was the work of an instant to dial. He picked up on the second ring. Lila, his voice, usually so unflappably professorial, held a tremor of naked anguish. The agents, they've just... I know. The words came out steadier than she could have hoped, buoyed by a curious sense of lightness ballooning beneath her ribs. It's over, Alexei. All of it. A ragged exhalation echoed down the line. Where are you? Are you safe? Lila gazed out the window at the tempest beyond the windshield, the biting sting of betrayal ebbing with each icy lash upon the glass. I'm exactly where I need to be. I never meant. Don't. Her voice remained level, but laced now with an iron certainty she scarcely recognized as her own. You don't get to write the ending to this story. This choice belongs to me. For the first time in my life, I'm the only author of my truth. Seconds of charged silence ensued, each tick of the dashboard clock an anvil in the confines of the cab. Finally, Alexei exhaled again, his capitulation whooshing across the crackling connection like a prayer for benediction in a church to which neither of them any longer held the key. Be happy, Lilia. If any of this was real, it was my love for you. Lila swallowed around the ache metastasizing in her throat. Every atom of her being yearned to believe him, to cling to the fantasy that even a love built on the rot of 1,000 deceptions could put down roots true and hale in the salty New England loam. But she had not shed the carapace of dutiful helpmeet only to martyr herself on the altar of misplaced devotion. Alexei. The syllables felt leaden and sweet on her tongue, an invocation and a requiem in one. Despite everything, I hope your freedom brings you peace. She ended the call before he could respond, before she could waver in her commitment to her own inexorable forward momentum. In a single fluid motion, she powered down the phone, pried open the back casing, and snapped the SIM card in two. The jagged plastic shards flashed dully in the dome light before she pitched them into the tangle of shrubbery in the verge beyond her window. With one last deep, centering breath, Lila touched her fingers to the little icon of the Madonna she had hung from the rearview mirror on a girlish whim in the first rosy flush of newlywed life. A talisman to protect the shining future she and Andre were meant to build together from the front seat of this very car. How young she had been, how recklessly, certifiably sure of her place in the natural order, sure of the infallibility of her own judgment, sure of the inherent goodness of the person to whom she had pledged her troth and her trust in that tiny, garland-strewn chapel. Giving the icon one last bittersweet caress, Lila reached up and gently twisted it free of its mooring. She held its slight gilded weight in her palm a moment, a benediction and a goodbye, before tucking it into the go-bag nestled at her feet. A touchstone of a life now consigned to memory. Lila put the car back in drive and coasted up to speed, windshield wipers thrumming out a brave little march against the downpour. For a fleeting instant, a fork of lightning speared the gloom beyond her headlights, bathing the highway in an eerie, unearthly luminance, the fleeting glimpse of a new path unfurling in the rearview, the specter of the familiar receding with each mile marker. As twilight settled over the Maine coast that September evening in 2026, Catherine and Alexei rejoined their family. The lighthouse beam began its nightly rotation, casting momentary illumination before returning to darkness, much like truth itself, appearing in flashes that briefly illuminate our lives before we return to the necessary mysteries of human connection. Their story had no perfect ending, no moment when the pain of deception completely vanished. Instead, they found something perhaps more valuable. The understanding that even lives built on secrets can contain genuine love, and that 40 years of shared history cannot be erased by revelations, no matter how shocking. Thanks so much for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more.